I want to begin by expressing again how much I appreciate what Bradley's been doing up here in his teaching. Another lesson this morning on worship. He's preached quite a series on worship and its importance and how to prepare for it. And I'm going to be following up on that tonight. He said this morning this would be the last lesson on worship. Well, maybe from him, but not from me. So I'm going to be talking about worship tonight. And what I say about Bradley, I mean that. I tell you, Bradley, I look back at some of the, I used to make extensive sermon outlines, and that's kind of what I'm going to be doing tonight, preaching from some sermon notes. But I used to make extensive notes, and I've saved a lot of those old sermons, and a lot of them I wouldn't preach today. I just wouldn't do it that way. But Bradley's sermons, I could preach those today. He's just doing so, he does so well with his lesson preparation and the depth of those lessons. And I thought through those sermons as I prepared this particular sermon as well. The church at West Fayetteville has asked me to speak on their summer series, and that's coming up soon. And they asked me to speak on the significance of worship. And so that's why I thought through some of the things Bradley has taught us, and that's why I'm going to bring this lesson tonight. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do that yet, but this is where I am at this time, and it'll help me get ready for them if I can go over some of the material I've studied to this point. Now, here's what I did, and it was a big task. When you think of the significance of worship, my thought was, well, what significance does God place on worship? And how can I tell? And the way to do that is, well, what does the Bible say about that? Because that's God's word. So what does he say about worship in his word? And what do I find in there that shows the significance he places on that? And I thought, how many times is worship mentioned in the Bible? And then how would you even count that? You know, you go through and how would you count by verses or by times is mentioned? Well, here's what I did. And it wasn't a simple task. I really worked hard at this. I decided I was going to start in Genesis and go through to Revelation and count page by page every page that mentions worship. Now, I kind of scanned through it, and I know my Bible well enough to know there's some pages I can just include and some I can just scan through. So it wasn't like I had to read every word to do it, but it was a big task. And I did it this way. Sometime God may mention worship one time on the page, and it may be very simple. It may be something like, well, Abraham built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. Well, that would be worship. So if that's counted on that page, I said, okay, I'm going to count that page. And then you come, like we've been studying here on Wednesday night, to the book of Exodus, where you got page after page after page, telling Israel how to build the temple, how to dress the priests, how to conduct the ceremonies. You get into the book of Leviticus, and it's page after page after page of the different offerings and the different sacrifices. And it goes on through the book of Numbers that way. And then take the book of Psalms. Every one of those Psalms has something to do with worship. They're prayers, they're praise songs, they're singing about God, they're thanksgiving. So you just count all of the book of Psalms. So sometimes there's great sections where you just go through several pages, and everything on the page is about worship. Sometimes it may just be mentioned maybe in just one verse on the whole page. But I counted all the pages that mentioned worship and then compared that to the number of pages in my Bible. This is the Bible I use. A little over 1,200 pages. See if I got the number here. 1,233 pages. How many of those pages do you think God said something about worship? Think it's 15%? 30%? It's more than that. Half of those pages say something about worship. It's a little over half, actually, but on average, just about every other page mentions worship. What that means is that if you take your Bible and you just open it up and you've got a page here and a page here, you've got a good chance of finding something about worship on every opening in your Bible. Now, there's going to be several pages where it's not going to mention it at all, but then there's several pages right together, so it's not an even spread through there. But to think that every opening, on average now, mentions worship, that shows God put some significance on worship, doesn't it? If the Bible says that much about it. In fact, what I found is, especially as I went through the prophets, and I saw how God was so disappointed with his people, there were two things that were emphasized in the scriptures about what God expects out of us. Now, one of those things was worship, and he wanted this worship to be right. The other thing was our behavior, especially on how we treat our fellow man. And doesn't that just match what Jesus said in the New Testament? What is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord thy God. And what is the second greatest? Well, it's likened to it. To love thy neighbor. And so a lot of time in our society, when I say, people get that flipped. I mean, they'll think, well, if you're good to your fellow man, if you're good to your neighbor, well, then you must be a pretty good man. But God put him first and your neighbor second. And they didn't have it flipped. A lot of people say, well, I'm good to everybody, and I make room for God. But that's not the way God describes it. You need to put God first and the worship of God first. Now, in doing that, I thought I might, now that took a long time just to make that one point, but I thought that would be significant. I thought that'd be a significant point. Now, how am I going to address this when I get to West Fayetteville? Here's what I think I'm going to do, and I'll do it tonight. I'm going to go through and look at some things the Bible teaches about worship. I surely won't look at all the things, but there's some significant things throughout the scriptures, and sort of like it's not quite a history of worship, but things we learn about worship as we read through the Bible. Now, we come across it very early in Genesis chapter 4, where Abel brings an offering unto the Lord from his flock. Now, Cain brought an offering too, but he didn't bring it from an animal offering. It was from the fruits that he had grown. And God had respect unto Abel in his offering, but in Cain's offering, he did not have respect. What does that tell you about worship? Well, one thing it tells you, and Bradley was talking about that this morning, worship means a sacrifice, doesn't it? They were both bringing something to sacrifice. If you're not giving in worship, then is it really worship? Even our singing is called the sacrifice. The fruit of our lips is a sacrifice of praise. So we think in worship, we're thinking about taking something and giving that over to God. It's a sacrifice that we're making. But we also learn that God doesn't respect every worship. Just because we make a sacrifice to worship God, that doesn't mean God's going to respect that. And you look at this account, and it's not real clear, not to me anyway, in Genesis, why God would respect Abel's offering and not respect Cain's. But when we come to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4, it becomes clear that by faith, Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice. That doesn't mean that Abel believed and Cain did not believe. They both believed in God, and they both came with a a conviction, a belief. But when you read that book of Hebrews chapter 11, and you read where people do things by faith, what they are doing is they're doing what God told them to do. And a good definition of faith is taking God at his word. And so you do things by faith. You're doing what God said. And then you go that and take that back to this account, to Cain and Abel. And Abel offered his sacrifice by faith. Abel did what God told him to do. God must have given him some kind of instruction concerning worship. And Abel did what the Lord said. And Cain did what he thought would be best for him, setting himself up as his religious authority rather than God. And so God respected Abel's, but he did not respect Cain. You know, worship is such a significant, it's so significant to man that worship can be very emotionally upsetting. Worship can be. And there's been a lot of division over worship. The first account of religious division in the scriptures is about worship, isn't it? And it didn't end well. Cain killed Abel. The first religious division, the first religious debate, the first religious persecution that resulted in a murder came about by way of worship. Well, that shows that there's something significant about worship, isn't there? And it places on us the obligation, the fact of we want to worship by faith. We want to worship the way that God tells us to worship. And so we look at the scriptures to try to find out, how does God want us to worship? Worship's about not what I think I like and what would make me feel good, but what does God want me to do? Now, the second time that you read about worship is when Noah comes out of the ark. Now, I know we sing and we talk about how Noah took 2 of every kind of animals into the ark, and he did. But if you'll remember of the clean animals, he took them in by 7s. I don't know if that was 7 animals. I think it may have been 7 pairs, 14. But instead of taking them 2 by 2, he took them in by 7 of the clean animals. Now, we don't know where God explained to Noah what animals were clean and which were unclean. He's later going to do that for Israel. And whether it was even the same criteria or not, we don't know. But he must have let Noah know something about the kind of animals that would be acceptable for worship and other kinds that would not. And when Noah comes out of that ark, he makes a sacrifice with his family. Noah, leading his family in worship, built an altar and made a sacrifice. And it tells us in Genesis 8:20 and 21, the Lord smelled a sweet savor. Now, I know when my neighbors are grilling or something outside, you smell the meat, and it's a good smell, isn't it? But if you thought about that God would enjoy our worship, that we can do something that brings God a pleasure, that brings God a joy. Our worship can come up to God as a sweet-smelling savor. And that expression is used several times through the scriptures and into the New Testament to describe that of something about which God is well pleased. When I think of all that God has done for me, of all the blessings he has, and what can I do for him? I mean, all the cattle on 1,000 hills are his, so what can I possibly do for God? And then find out God will take pleasure in my worship. that makes me want to worship. That makes me want to be here when we gather together in worship. It is something that we can do that gives God joy. And you think what all He has done for us, that there's something we can do that would please God and bring pleasure to Him. That shows the significance of worship, doesn't it? Now we go on reading and we come to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What you find is that they would build altars and they would worship. Abraham comes to Shechem. As soon as he enters the promised land, builds an altar and worship. He moves to Bethel. He builds an altar and worship. He goes down and goes to Egypt, comes back to Bethel. First thing he does, he sacrifices on an altar and worship. In fact, it's been said, when you start reading that and go through Genesis, do it sometime and look for that. You say you could follow the journeys of the patriarchs from the smoke that comes from their altars. They would lead their families in worship to God. And there's a couple of passages in there that I think is significant about what they did. I'm looking at Genesis chapter 26, 25. This is when Isaac goes to Beersheba. Now, we would know that as Beersheba, wouldn't we? Beersheba, but my pronouncing Bible has it where you're supposed to pronounce it Beersheba when you're talking about the Bible. So Beersheba, Isaac goes there, and here's what it says about him. He builded an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants digged a well. Is there a priority here? Well, casually, I think there may be. First thing he did, when he comes to Beersheba, he builds an altar. Then he pitches a tent, and then he digs a well. Why would he dig a well? Well, his livestock, they needed water. That's his livelihood. That's his business. But what does he do before he tends to his business? He builds an altar and worships God first. And then he pitches his tent. See, that's where he would live. That's for his family. He put God first. He prioritized the well-being of his family. And now my cattle are thirsty. Now that I've got those two things taken care of, I'm going to go dig a well and go about providing for them so I can take care of my business and my livelihood. And that is a priority that is consistent throughout Scriptures about putting God first and the importance of family. And I could get off on this, but too many men have put such a priority on their livelihood that they have neglected their family. And I will say this, and I'm not bragging, but I always thought my livelihood was the way I took care of my family. And I never thought that that was more important than my family. It was just something I used as a means to provide for that which was the most important to me. That and my worship to God. And so that seems to be Isaac's priorities as well when he came to Beersheba. But then there's the other instance, and that is the one Bradley was talking about this morning. Genesis chapter 22, verse 5. Abide ye here. I and the lad will go yonder and worship. And you know what God had told Abraham to do? And when you read it, it's almost as though God made this just as emotionally difficult for Abraham as it could be. Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. I mean, every step of that makes it just more and more critical, doesn't it? And Abraham rose to the occasion, and he was ready to sacrifice his son. in worship to God. Now, he didn't do it because the angel stopped him. God provided the ram like we talked this morning. But if worship was that important, if doing what God says was so important that Abraham would take that son whom he loved and be willing to offer that unto God, don't you think we ought to put a priority on worship and think about how important our worship is? Now, we'll go on through and we come to the Ten Commandments. Moses bringing Israel to the foot of Mount Sinai. And I like to say it like this: God made this nation and he gave them life when they crossed the Red Sea. And he gave them a way to live when he taught them the law. When he built the tabernacle and so, he gave them a reason to live. It had to do with God, and it had to do with worship. When God gave the Ten Commandments, the first two commandments have to do with worship. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have, here it is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now that's the King James Version, before me. If you look, some other translations will have it this way. And looking at other scriptures, you know this is right. He said, thou shalt have no other God beside me. It's not me and another God or two out there, and I'll be the first God and let these others be the second, third, fourth God. No, no other God beside me. You worship me, and you worship me only. And he goes on in verse 5 and said, the Lord thy God is a jealous God. Now, we often associate the idea of jealousy with envy, but they're not the same. And in fact, envy, when the translators did the King James Version, I'm not sure about all the translations, but in the King James Version, I think you're going to find it consistent. The envy is always negative, but jealousy is always positive. Here's the difference in jealousy and envy. We might confuse them in the way we speak of it and such, and maybe the way sometime, but that's all right. I'm talking about what it means when it says, the Lord thy God's a jealous God. He's not envious. God's not envious, but he's jealous. Envy is that desire that you would have for something that you're not entitled to. That'd be envy. But jealousy is that desire for what you are entitled to. God is entitled to our worship. And he doesn't want the worship due to him shared with anything else, anyone else, any other God. He's a jealous God. You know, sometimes couples, husbands and wives, wife see another woman showing affection toward her husband, make her jealous. Well, it should. She's the one entitled to her husband's affection. That's a good attribute. And so also the husband and the wife. You should be jealous. That's what you're entitled to. It's no one else's. And so God is a jealous God. We don't worship another. And then he says this, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything. God cares what we think about him. He wants us to understand him. In fact, the best way to understand God is to understand Jesus. He said, I came to show thee the Father. And the more we understand Jesus, the more we understand who God is. And then we look through the Bible and we see God in all his attributes. And he's not like an animal. And I don't want you making me look like an animal. And so we read in the book of Romans that it says in Romans 1 in verse 23, they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, and the birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. You know what they did? After they started thinking about God as an animal, they started acting like animals. God's made us in His image. He wants us to model who we are after Him. And don't make me look like an animal and create things like that. When they went up, when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to receive those instructions about building the tabernacle, he came down, and what had the people done? They had fashioned a golden calf and said, "These be the gods that brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt." Well, man left to his own degrades himself and degrades his concept of God. It said they sat down to eat and arose up to play. And through the worship of false gods, Baal, Ashtaroth, Molech, Chemos, worship degraded into drunken orgies and animal sacrifice. And all throughout that history of Israel, all the way up to the time that Nebuchadnezzar carried them into captivity, God is struggling with them. Don't go after the gods of this land. I'm Jehovah God that brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. You worship me. And they degraded themselves with their vanities. But then we come to those instructions concerning the tabernacle. Now, we've been studying this on Wednesday night. I think it was about 7 pages about building the tabernacle, and then I think it was 7 chapters, and then 6 chapters about how they did what Moses said. And God gave very specific instructions about how he wanted to be worshiped. I'm going to read this to you, and it might get a little monotonous, but this is going to make an impact when you hear this. It says in Exodus 25:9, according to all that I showed thee after the pattern. The pattern. God had a specific way he wanted all this done. After the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. Exodus 25:40, look, that thou make them after the pattern which was shown thee in the mount. Now, I'm going to start reading. Watch this. Verse after verse after verse after verse, and you'll get the importance here. Exodus 35:4, this is the thing that the Lord commanded. Exodus 35:10, make all that the Lord commanded. Exodus 35:29, bring all manner of work which the Lord commanded. Exodus 36:1, according to all that the Lord had commanded. Exodus 35:6, the work which the Lord commanded to make. Exodus 38:21, according to the commandment of Moses. Exodus 39:1, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:5, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:7, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:21, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:26, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:29, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:31, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:32, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 42, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 39:43, they had done as the Lord commanded. Exodus 40:16, thus did Moses according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Exodus 40:19, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:21, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:23, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:25, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:27, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:29, as the Lord commanded Moses. Exodus 40:32, as the Lord commanded Moses. Do you get the point? God said, you do it after this pattern that I've shown thee in the mount. And over and over and over and over what they did, They did as the Lord commanded Moses. Let me show you what God thought about that. First, he thought enough about it to make sure we got the point, didn't he? But then it says in Exodus 40 in verse 34, then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Go on and read. It was so great Moses himself couldn't even enter into it. He approved of that. They did what he said. And he brought his glory into that. That's the significance that God placed on that worship. And then we see this in Leviticus 10. When Nadab and Abihu, you go on and read that chapter, it sounds like they'd been drinking. And they weren't being careful. And Nadab and Abihu enter into the tabernacle. And when it comes time to burn the incense, they brought strange fire. What's the contrast? As the Lord commanded not. See the difference? Strange fire. Now, I'm not a fan of the New International Version, but it says unauthorized fire. I wonder if Nadab and Abihu said, well, what about this fire? Well, the Lord didn't say not to. I wonder if they had that conversation. They could had, as the Lord commanded not. They did something that God had not authorized. And you know what happened? The fire came out and burned Nadab and Abihu is what it did. That is quite a lesson, isn't it? That when we approach God, we do it the way Moses approached that burning bush. Take thy shoes from off thy feet. The ground whereon thou standest is holy. We don't come to God with just any old thing. We come to God to see what does the Lord require of us. And that's what we want to bring into our worship. And so you go into Leviticus and Numbers, and you have page after page after page after page of how to do the sacrifices, the offerings, the washings, the holy days, the feast, the fast, the rituals, the sprinkling of blood, all these different things that they're doing. And it all had to do with material things. Now we don't study Leviticus and Numbers a whole lot, but I understand that was the books the priests studied the most because they wanted to make sure they were worshiping the Lord the way he said. So that's where they learned how to do it. But when we come to the New Testament, these things were called fleshly and carnal and worldly and weak and beggarly elements. Now, God told them to do it this way. And so much of it was about external things that they were doing. But in the New Testament, there's a change when it comes to worship. Jesus had that conversation with a woman at the well. And when she found out he's a prophet, it's interesting, I think. She found out he's a prophet and thought, okay, let's argue about worship. Anybody ever treat you that way? Oh, you go to Church of Christ. You don't believe in music, do you? See, first thing I want to do is bring up some kind of controversy over worship. Well, this woman at the well finds out, well, I see that you're a prophet. Now, we worship in this mountain, and you worship on that mountain. Which mountain are we supposed to worship on? See, bring up a worship controversy. And the Lord said, now he told her, right, he said, you worship, you know not what. We know what we worship, salvation of the Jews. But he said this, the time is coming, neither in this mountain nor that. Here's what would come, the change. They that worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. It's not about what mountain you're on. It's not going to be external things. In spirit and in truth. I sometimes wonder, you know, those Samaritans, they wanted to worship. That they had the desire to worship God, and they were worshiping on the wrong mountain. But they, in spirit, they wanted to worship. The Jews, they were worshiping at the temple, They were going through all the rituals, yet a lot of their worship had become vain and hypocritical, and it was all external. They were worshiping God in truth. And our worship is to be in spirit and in truth, not one to the exclusion of the other. And it's also more spiritual. Those weak and beggarly elements. I'm so glad we don't have to worship the way Israel did. He told them, put on clean clothes, come to worship, and then they sprinkle blood all over you. Aren't you glad we don't do that? What a mess it would be to have to worship that way and have burnt sacrifices and all these washings and all these external things. There's very, very little of that in the New Testament. Worship is much more simpler when it comes to the externals, but it requires more out of us internally. And the things that we do are spiritual worship. And so we go to the New Testament, and we don't find a chapter on, okay, this is the command. Here's the command on how to worship. Largely how we learn how to worship in the New Testament is by looking at the example of what did the New Testament church do. And then we follow that example. It begins very early. Acts chapter 2 and verse 42. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and breaking of bread and in prayers. Well, that's teaching. Fellowship is sharing. That's giving. And it says breaking of bread, which is what we do when we take the Lord's Supper. And they're praying together. And then it goes down in verse 7, praising God. Well, there's 5 things that we see that early church was doing early on in worship to God. Very little of it had anything to do with a formal ceremony or formal ritual like those priests. Now, we want to do things decently in order, and we do that. And so we run into patterns about how we do things because we want our worship to be decent and orderly, but it's not about externals, except a little thing. There's the Lord's Supper. It's what the Lord instituted at the very last Passover. I'll do it with you new in my kingdom. Do this in remembrance of me. Now we come to the church at Corinth. And as Paul was writing to the church at Corinth, he had told them about how to worship. He says that in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 2, I praise you. You keep the ordinances as they're delivered unto you. That word is also translated traditions. You're doing what I told you to do, and I praise you for that. And he said, I teach the same thing in every church. It's the same thing. So he would go around teaching them the ordinances to keep. And among those things was the Lord's Supper. But the Corinthians had turned the Lord's Supper into something like they saw all their pagan neighbors do. They'd gather together and have a feast together with their God, and they'd turn the Lord's Supper into something to satisfy their hunger. And the divisions they had among themselves were show out. Paul said, I praise you not for this. You're not taking the Lord's Supper. You're taking your own supper. And he set them straight. He said, now this is how the Lord said to do it. And he repeated and showed again what the Lord had done on that Passover about passing the cup and the breaking of the bread. And it's not a fleshly meal to satisfy your flesh. There wasn't anything wrong with the coming together to eating, but don't think that's the Lord's Supper. This is a sacred meal. This is a memorial meal. It's not about the satisfaction of your flesh. You do this in remembrance of God. And don't do it in an unworthy manner. And so he taught them about the Lord's Supper. Now, they would take that when they were gathered together. And we read in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, they would gather together on the first day of the week. So here it's coming clear. Jesus said, as often as you take it, do it in remembrance of me. How often were they doing it in Corinth? Doing it on the first day of the week when they came together. And that's when they would take the Lord's Supper. And then we see another account in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. That doesn't mean that's the only time they ate together. But there was something special about the first day of the week. And that's what we do to this day. And we want to do it the way the Lord told us to do it. And so we try to do it in a reverent manner. Every time we do it, someone repeats and emphasizes the significance of this. Is there a ritual involved? Well, not a rigid ritual, but it does involve the fruit of the vine. And it does involve the unleavened bread. And so we take those things. But beyond that, what are we doing in worship? Is it externals? We're teaching God's words, what we're doing. Paying attention to God as His word is preached. We're praying together. We're singing praises. And we're sacrificing, giving something to God. And that's what the New Testament church was doing. And so we look at this and seeing the importance God places on worship. Let's see what they did that met God's approval. Let's worship in that fashion. And then we come to the book of Revelation. John lifts up his eyes, and the heavens are open. And he sees in his vision scenes from heaven. And so many of the scenes, the things he sees in heaven, are about worship. The elders, 4 and 20, casting their crowns before the throne, with thousands and thousands and 10,000s of angels singing God's praise. And throughout the book of Revelation, we see these things in heaven, and they're worshiping God and praising God and glorifying God. And I've heard people say, well, what's heaven going to be like? Well, I hope we don't just have to go up there and spend all our time in worship. And they don't understand the significance of worship. What a glory to be able to worship God right there before His throne. Now, when I worship, I get weary. I get tired. And sometimes we'll have that singing at Old Philadelphia. I'll tell you, after about a couple of hours, I can't hardly sing. But I love it so much. I would glory to be in a land where we never grow old, with a voice that'll never grow weary, and worship God. Now, I don't know what all heaven's going to be like, but I'm focused in on worship. Sometimes I think when we gather together, it's like we're practicing, aren't we? You ever done practice? You ever been in a choir or chorus or something? You practice your song and then you do it. And sometimes, okay, we're practicing. We're learning how to worship God now. And when we get before His throne, we'll be prepared and we'll sing with the angels forever and ever our praises toward God. And I long for that when I go to worship. Now, there's one other thing that I want to mention about worship, and I'll let you go home. That is, let's go to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Because, as I've spoken before here, we can cancel out our worship if we don't have lives that we're living right. You can't worship God right if you're not living right. I mean, that goes together. The way we treat one another, if we don't treat one another right, we can't turn around and worship God right. God says, I'm tired of that. I don't want to hear your offerings. I don't want your sacrifices. If that's the way you're going to be, so we live right, we can worship right. Now, here's what it says in Romans chapter 12. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. That's our sacrifice, isn't it? It's to be holy, it's to be acceptable unto God, and it says, which is your reasonable service. Now, that I see the translators struggle from translation to translation, just how do you translate reasonable service? And the New International Version, which I'm not fond of, it says here, that's your service of worship. And people have grasped onto that and said, well, everything we do in life is worship. Well, everything Abraham did in life wasn't worship. He told his servants, you stay here, I will go yonder and worship. He's going to do something different than what he was doing with his servants, wasn't he? So what does this mean? Reasonable service. The words reasonable service are the words that are used to describe the work that a priest does when he prepares a sacrifice and offers it on the altar. Well, that is a worship. But now we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. That's your reasonable worship. That's your reasonable service. Does that mean everything we do in life is worship? No, this is an analogy. Look at the analogy. You're offering your life in service to God. Let that be your reasonable service, your priestly service, and offering your life to God. And so that's how to have acceptable worship. You live right, and then the spiritual things that you do for worship that the New Testament church did, that's where God will glory. And it gets back then again to where we ended up last week, I think, James 1:27. Pure religion. You think of religion, what are you doing religiously? Well, pure religion and undefiled. Pure religion. Visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. Undefiled religion. Keep yourself unspotted from this world. If you live a living sacrifice to God, then bring your gift to the altar. God will accept your worship. Now that's the significance God places on it. And knowing that's how God places on it, look, what significance do we place on worship? Well, that needs to be our priority, doesn't it? To love the Lord thy God with all our heart, and then to love our neighbors. So, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, they talked about coming to God, the tabernacle, to work. He said, a stranger shall not enter therein. Worship's not for everyone. It's for God's people. If you want to worship God acceptably, you need to come to God on His terms. Turn away from every other way. Confess His name before men. Be baptized into Christ. And then you rise up. You're one of God's priests. And now come to God in worship. So if you need to do that, have an opportunity to let us know as we sing the invitation song.